The Wrong Object started in 2002. It was a quartet at first, featuring an English pataphysician named Andrew Norris. And Andrew Norris was a kind of writer and artist in residence on the stage. And we didn't have any official recordings at the time. The first really real recording we did was with Ed Mann at Zappanale, which was a recording we did, a live recording we did with Ed, which never got actually released as an official album because it had to remain a promo for various reasons. Then the band evolved into a quintet in 2004, and a year later we met Elton Dean, and we did that record with Elton, which was our first Moon June release in 2005. The next stage, the next thing we did for Moon June was a studio album called Stories from the Shed in 2008. Between the two, we did something with Annie Whitehead and Harry Beckett for Jazzprint, which was called Platform One, which was a much more jazz-oriented and swing-oriented thing, featuring some of Annie's and Harry's compositions.
Yeah.
And after Stories from the Shed, which was in many ways, which made us visible as a band which was no longer necessarily associated with the Zappa cover scene, even though our covers were always and still are a bit unorthodox. We did another Zappa-related project with Zappa's nephew, Stanley Jason, at Zappanale, which was released by Fazul Records in Switzerland. And then there was a period characterized by a state of option, where Laurent, the drummer Laurent Delchambre, and I were the only surviving members of the old lineup, and we had to reconstruct a new band. It took us at least 3 years to really get to the stage where we could call ourselves The Wrong Object again, and which would be solid and experienced enough and committed enough to the music so that we felt ready to go back into the studio in 2013, which led to the new album after the exhibition.
Where did the name The Wrong Object come from originally?
As far as I can remember, the name The Wrong Object came from a series of sessions we did back in 2002, that's 11 years ago, at the time when we were playing with musical objects, and creating new songs based on musical object sequences. We were writing with a view to improvising around them and sequencing them in a specific order, with a view to creating songs which were bound to sound rather weird and filled with rhythmic and conceptual changes, because it was like a collage thing at the time. So The Wrong Object, I think I came up with that expression because it was not a reference to Zappa or anything like that. It was just a reference to the idea that we had to choose the musical object which was weird enough to be collaged to the previous one and to the next one, so that we could create a sequence which was aesthetically gratifying for the band. Mm-hmm. So it really goes back to that collagist approach. Well, there is a song called Wrong But Not False on the album, which was written by Pierre Motet, our bass player. Now the title of the song, Wrong But Not False, was written on the charts when Pierre started the rehearsal and began to hand in the different parts to us. So it was obviously a way for him, I think, to refer to the name of the band, and the ambiguity of trying to be weird and dissonant while trying to be right on, at least to the best of our abilities. But it was a kind of a joke at first, self-referential joke. But I'm glad we did that piece. It's one of my favorite pieces on the album, actually.
Yeah.
The Wrong Object was never a 100% Zappa cover band. We, as early as in 2002, late 2002, we were playing gigs in Belgium, in Liège, in Brussels, and in various locations, which featured maybe 50% of Zappa material and 50% of my own compositions. And that was how the band developed for quite some time, I'd say 3 or 4 years. The 50-50 thing was also very comfortable for us, because we were getting more and more gigs. The band was hired on the basis that he would cover some Zappa songs, but there was a plus because my compositions sound Zappa-esque enough to be mistaken for Zappa songs, which was surprising at first. But then I began to realize that people who didn't know the repertoire well enough couldn't distinguish between the Zappa originals and the Wrong Object originals, which was quite flattering at first. But then it became increasingly frustrating for us to be considered as a part-time Zappa cover band. And Stories from the Shed was really a major breakthrough for us in 2007 when we recorded it, in 2008 when it came out, because it was the very first record where the Wrong Object could boast about having written its own repertoire, and there was no Zappa cover, no cover whatsoever in it. And it's the path we've been following for the last 6 years. Well, when I was starting the Wrong Object, the main influences besides Zappa were the Canterbury scene. Obviously, I've always been a big fan, and even a collector. I'm not a collector at heart, but when I was a teenager, I would collect Canterbury scene records. I would go to Paris, or London, to some obscure secondhand record shops and buy the things that were missing in my collection. So yes, a mix of Zappa-esque and Canterbury influences. Hatfield and the North was the most seminal influences of all. The Soft Machine, the early Soft Machine, the Cardinal period, featuring Elton Dean, so end of the 60s, early 70s, was also a major influence. That is not to say that our influences were limited to rock or prog rock or alternative prog, Canterbury rock material. I was particularly interested in doing something which approached the condition of chamber rock music as well. So Stravinsky, or chamber jazz, whatever you call it, and Mingus were also major influences on the act of composition. We never wanted to confine ourselves to developing one single thread, which may have been a disadvantage or an advantage depending on the circumstances, because people sometimes find it hard to classify us or put a label on our music. But all those influences somehow, in a subterranean way, were seminal to the whole history of the band, which now spans more than a decade. I started to play the guitar when I was 12 or 13, I think, and I was at the Music Academy here in Seraing, near Liège. I was playing classical guitar at the time that I moved to the United States, and when I started to play there, I became a self-taught jazz rock musician, for want of a better word. So I bought my first electric guitar in Belgium, but then soon after that, when I was 18, or maybe 4 years later when I left for the States, I sold it, and it was a Gibson, and I bought an Ibanez instead, which is still the guitar I'm using these days in connection with my guitar synth. When I was in America, I started to play and record my own kind of music, which was basically the kind of music I never heard on the radio, and I wish I had been able to hear. At least that's what I was trying to do, obviously, on my four-tracker. It was an analog Fostech four-tracker, and I had a Fender amp and my Ibanez, and I was writing songs, some of which were arranged and performed by the Wrong Object in the early years. But so it was my first instrument, and since then I've been developing not a passion, but a liking for other kinds of string instruments. The bouzouki, which is featured on the Machine Mass trio record, as Real Thinking, and I've been increasingly drawn to the possibilities of electronic music and loops, particularly those which are afforded by Ableton Live, and I'm using that program quite a lot in recent releases.
And the guitar synthesizer you mentioned.
The guitar synth I bought after I returned to the States. About 6 months later, I met a guy who was selling a guitar synth, and I bought it from him, and I started to explore its possibilities. It must have been 2001, and I discovered that some of the sounds could be used for two main purposes. One of them was to thicken or alter the sound of the guitar sound, and the other one was to use the synth as an instrument, as a real instrument for its own sake, and produce weird sounds which occur when you switch off the guitar sound completely. And I started to customize the sounds which I found useful. There are not too many of them. I would say that I'm using 20-25 different sounds, and I think I've got 10 sounds which I'm using on a regular basis, but I would never venture into the cheesy sounds that I never liked in the first place, and which even when they get customized will never sound very interesting to me. So I use it extensively, but also in a very circumscribed way, because most of the sounds I use are sounds that I've customized in order that they sound completely different from what they were programmed to sound in the first place. For instance, I discovered that I could, and this is the Canterbury scene again, emulate the sound of Mike Ratledge's organ by adding a lot of vibrato effects to the the oboe sound, preset sound on the Roland synth. So that's how it happened. But of course, the fingering, the touch, everything that concerns the execution of the piece is very different. So if you play a theme, it's not going to sound like Mike Ratledge, but the possibilities of altering the sound and making it at once familiar and different from the original sound, which Soft Machine fans will immediately recognize, especially if you quote a Soft Machine tune from time to time. It's a way of winking at them. Yeah. It will sound both familiar and strange, which is what I like in music, in fact. That's what the Germans call unheimlich. It's the strange and the familiar, which create this feeling of unease. I think the band as a whole, and the Wrong Object, as the name indicates to some extent, want to achieve is precisely this blending of the familiar and the strange, which is something which is reflected in the arrangements we do, but also in the compositions themselves. When we play a track live, it's never the same. We always add new things, new variations, and we keep some slots open for improvisation. So that's one way of making a well-known tune strange. Another way to do that is to work at the level of composition, and it's something I've been trying to do for a long time. We started by working with musical objects, but and the collagist approach is still there. I think if you listen to the music carefully, the different movements, and some of them can be very short. Sometimes they're only a couple of bars, or it's just 3 or 4 bars, and the changes in rhythm and rhythm signatures occur one after the other. And I don't think the music is inaccessible, because every single unit is rather, if you take them separately, is rather melodic and fairly accessible as such. But the sequencing of the units into a piece which most people describe as polyrhythmic or experimental is bound to feel strange or weird or unexpected. But the units themselves, I think, remain quite melodic, and sometimes they are citational, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they are pointing to a specific kind of music, but it could be Square Pusher, it could be Zappa, it could be Messiaen, it could be Stravinsky, but everything happens in a single piece. And that is, of course, something we somehow inherited from Zappa. But I think that more and more people, and it's heartening thought, are realizing that we have become a different band, and that our music is somehow related to that tradition, but it is also immediately recognizable as being our own. Basically, if I had to compare Stories from the Shed or the old lineups and this lineup, I would say that in the previous lineups there was a horn section, a jazz section, which was interacting with a rock band, with Laurent being in between and handling both masterfully, both the rock and the jazz thing. But there was a kind of opposition which I greatly enjoyed, because it was the opposite of fusion. It was jazz versus rock, and it was a kind of friendly battle taking place within the band. Whereas now we have all the members of the band are equally at ease in the rock and the jazz areas in different but related ways. And we don't have that struggle anymore. We have a different kind of struggle, which results from the fact that every single member of the band is involved in different rock or jazz-oriented projects, and it's a different kind of alchemy, and which is probably which creates a different kind of energy, which is not less powerful or more powerful than that of Stories or Platform One, but which is definitely geared towards a more ambivalent musical object, which is no longer characterized by the refusal of blending jazz and rock, or the intention of opposing them to one another, but by something which is which comes closer to a kind of interaction, which is bigger, I think, than the sum of the band's part, and that is something which I find very different from what happened earlier. It was obvious in the old lineup that Jean-Paul and Fred were playing out of the jazz tradition and bring something to the music which is great, because it was unusual to have them, to have rock or prog rock band perform with a strong, very strong horn section, which was interacting with us, but from the jazz, coming from the jazz tradition, and playing sometimes even standard jazz lines, but yes, it's definitely the major change I would underline at this stage. Yes, I am combining The Wrong Object with other bands. I have been very lucky over the last 4-5 years. One thing leading to another again, and Moon June being a label which I think constitutes a kind of musical family rather than just a list of bands. I was given the opportunity to explore other fields, other musical territories, in the company of Alex McGuire and Tony Bianco, the Doubt Trio. I was also involved in the Wyatt tribute band, Comico Operando, and the last, I'm also involved in 48 Cameras, which is a very different project, which is more ambient like. And the last band I've been involved in is Machine Mass, which used to be called Machine Mass Trio. The first album is Realist Thinking, which was released by Moon June 2 or 3 years ago, was called Machine Mass Trio. But Tony Bianco and I decided to keep the word Machine Mass, the expression Machine Mass, to describe the duet. Don't ask me who is the machine and who's the mass, but we are working. Our intention now is to work with different musicians. And the last collaboration we did was with Dave Liebman. So we did that studio session, and we liked it. It will be the next Moon June release in November. Mm-hmm. Recently, we had the opportunity to test the lineup on stage, and we had a lot of fun. It was a very rewarding experience for the three of us. And that particular project is characterized by the use of electronic loops. We don't have a bass player. I occasionally play some bass lines on the guitar synth, but most of the bass lines are produced by computers, and most of them are composed by Tony Bianco. And Dave Liebman happened to be the ideal addition to the Machine Mass duo. Now the real challenge, is to play against electronic loops. Mm-hmm. It's a challenge for the drummer, for Tony, who has to keep time despite the complexity, the huge complexity of his loops. And it's also a challenge for Dave Liebman and I, because the tonality changes all the time, so it gives you a sense of freedom, but it also requires a lot of concentration. I've always wanted to play with guests in the context of The Wrong Object, and as well as in other contexts. The specificity of The Wrong Object is that its whole history has been characterized by collaborations with guests. And the whole history has been punctuated by guest appearances from people I've always admired. Annie Whitehead, Elton Dean, Alex McGuire, the late Harry Beckett, and more recently, after the exhibition, we developed a collaboration with Benoit Morlin of Gong and Mike Oldfield fame, who's a very brilliant percussionist, in addition to be a very nice and easy guy to work with. So what he did, we hired the studio for a day, and he played some overdubs on some of the tracks, and then we played other tracks live with him in the studio. And we're planning to play some festival dates and continue to play with Benoit, and hopefully there will be opportunities to play gigs in the near future. But it's always been something which is rather specific to The Wrong Object. The idea is not just to have sidemen play or double heads or harmonize on heads and play solos. All the people we've worked with so far, whether it's, we're talking about Annie or Harry or Elton, brought something to the repertoire. They brought their own tunes, they also brought their own ideas, and we were playing their tunes, they were playing our tunes. And that is how the collaboration developed. So it's not just The Wrong Object featuring X, Y, or Z. It is a real collaboration between musicians, and it's been working quite well so far, I think. And Benoit wrote a piece especially for us, which sounds both a little gongish and I think is also inspired by what he heard before. I mean, he's had our CDs for a long time, which is completely in tune with the rest of the repertoire. So it's great fun to work with him. All the guests we've worked with so far are somehow associated with the Canterbury scene, which returns us to one of my obsessions for the last 30 years. It started early. I was a teenager when I was listening to the Soft Machine, Hatfield and North, and Caravan, and all those wonderful Canterbury bands. Also thanks to Leonardo Pavkovic of Munjun Records, of his relentless and support and promotional work, which was extremely important. But Leonardo has been very instrumental in creating new avenues of collaborations, which were hitherto unknown to me. And I thank him very much for that.
I think there's one piece which is a collective composition.
Yes. Yes, the Jungle Cow suite sounds a bit grand and pompous, but comprises 3 parts. The first part was completely improvised, actually it was at first an improvisation which was separate from the piece, the 2 other parts which I wrote, and I thought that it occurred to me during rehearsal that we needed something to start the piece with, and we all agreed that we needed to have an intro. And instead of writing an intro, we decided to, and we didn't have a collective improvisation on the record yet. We decided to improvise, and Antoine's role was to put an end to the improvisation at the right time, which is when it gets boring, or right before it gets boring, rather, by introducing the piano arpeggio, which is at the beginning of part 2. The Unbelievable Truth was a title I wrote especially for Elton Dean. We were supposed to play with Lowell Coxhill. We had a series of gigs planned in 2006, 2005, 2006. And then Lowell withdrew for health reasons. And I decided to call Elton Dean because I thought, okay, maybe the approach with Lowell would have been much more improvisational. And I decided at the time to call Elton Dean and see what could happen. And the deal was, okay, between Elton and I, before I put it to the band, was, okay, we can play your music and you can play our music if you like it. And you happen to like some of the stuff we had written, but instead of repeating ourselves, I decided to write 4 pieces especially for him, one of which was called The Unbelievable Truth. At first, it was a reference to the Hartley movie. And I think I just needed a title, and there you go. I wrote it on top of the chart that I sent to Elton. But then, retrospectively, I started to have different feelings about that title, and a lot of people associated it with Elton's untimely death, which makes a lot of sense, of course. So retrospectively, the title began to acquire a different meaning, because the unbelievable truth is that despite Elton's poor health and the gigs that had to be cancelled following the rehearsals we did here in this house, and he was staying at my place, and he got really ill, had to be put on a train on this next, on the Thalys, and had to go back to Paris. And we did that gig in Paris. And Elton, after being in the hospital for more than a week, after having undergone a transfusion, played what he himself described as a great gig. And I think he plays extremely well on that record, that live record we did with him. And so yes, it was unbelievable. I think that the record happened and was released, and I think Leonardo recognized that, and he saw the potential of the collaboration, which unfortunately, and despite the musical and practical potentialities of the project, because we began to receive a lot of offers from promoters and venues all over Europe. It never happened, but we have that thing, which is the record, which is a testimony to, which testifies to Elton's unbelievable talent as an improviser, and also as someone who would learn the themes and play music, and was a brave fighter on the cause on behalf of alternative music.